There's a specific kind of man who tells you exactly who he is. And somehow, that's the most dangerous thing about him. Gideon Barlow built one of Nashville's best restaurants with his own hands, runs his kitchen like a man who answers to no one, and has made it very clear to every woman who's ever gotten close that he doesn't stay. Freya Ellsworth knows all of this. She's a nutritionist, she's precise, she's careful. She moved to Nashville to rebuild her life, not to complicate it. They were supposed to be professional partners. That was the entire plan. But there's something happening in the space between them that neither of them has figured out how to shut down. And tonight, in a quiet restaurant after closing, it almost became something they couldn't take back. Almost. If this is your first time here, welcome. You picked a good one to start with. Hit subscribe, leave a like, and tell us where you're watching from. We have a whole community of people who take their romance stories seriously, and you're going to fit right in. This is part 2 of Freya and Gideon's story, and I promise you, it only gets better from here. I almost called in a schedule conflict. I had the text half written on Sunday night, something professional, something clean, something that would buy me enough distance to get my head back in order. I deleted it. Not because I was brave, but because I knew that canceling wouldn't actually change anything. It would just mean I'd spent a week avoiding something that would still be there when I came back. So Tuesday came, and I walked into Embers the same way I always did. 5 minutes early, folder in hand, sensible shoes on a kitchen floor that had no patience for anything else. Gideon was at the pass when I came in, marking up a ticket, and he looked up when he heard the door. Just for a second, then back down at the ticket. "Freya," he said, like nothing had happened, like Thursday had been any other Thursday. "Morning," I said, and went to my table. That was how we handled it, apparently. And for about an hour, it worked. The kitchen moved the way it always did. I worked through my notes on the new menu rollout, and the professional architecture we'd built held its shape. Then he came and sat across from me during a lull in the prep, which he didn't usually do, and set a small espresso cup on my side of the table without comment. I looked at it, then at him. "I didn't ask for this," I said. "You've been here 2 hours and you haven't eaten anything," he said. "That's not an answer." "It's the one I've got," he said, and pulled my menu notes toward him, like that was the reason he'd sat down. I drank the espresso. It was perfect, which was irritating. We worked through the notes together, which was also what we'd been doing for weeks. Except that now, every time his hand moved near mine on the page, I was aware of it in a way that had nothing to do with nutrition planning. At one point, he leaned across to point at something I'd written, and his shoulder pressed briefly against mine. Warm, solid, completely ordinary. And I kept my eyes on the page and my breathing even and thought, with great focus, about literally anything else. It didn't entirely work. What made it worse was that he wasn't performing anything. He wasn't leaning in deliberately, wasn't manufacturing reasons to be close. He was just there, the way he always was. Present in that specific way of his that made you feel like the room had gotten smaller. That was the thing I hadn't accounted for when I'd told myself this was manageable. That his attention wasn't a strategy. It was just him. And somehow that was harder to defend against than anything calculated would have been. By the end of the afternoon, the kitchen was running full dinner prep, and I was packing up to leave, when he appeared at the end of the table and said, quietly enough that no one else would hear, "I should have put the phone away." I looked up at him. His expression was even, but his jaw had that slight tension it got when something cost him something to say. "It doesn't matter," I said. "It does," he said, "and you know it does." I held his gaze for a moment, and the kitchen noise around us felt very far away. "Gideon," "I'm not asking for anything," he said, cutting me off gently. "I just wanted you to know that I know." I nodded once. He nodded back. And then Alex called his name from across the kitchen, and he was gone, back into the noise, back into the role of a man who had everything under control. I stood there for a second longer than I needed to, because what he'd just said was the most honest thing anyone had said to me in months. And the most terrifying part was that it wasn't enough to make me want to leave. Thursday came with rain, the kind that starts quietly in the early morning and by afternoon has settled in like it owns the place. Steady, gray, making the whole city feel smaller and closer than usual. I noticed it on my drive to Embers and told myself it meant nothing. Weather is weather. It doesn't set the mood unless you let it. I let it a little. The kitchen was warm against the cold outside, and the contrast hit me the moment I walked in. The smell of something braising low and slow, the sound of rain against the high windows, the particular amber light that the overheads threw across the prep stations when the natural light was gone. It felt, uncomfortably, like somewhere you'd want to stay. Gideon was breaking down a whole fish at the center island, and he looked up when I came in with that same unhurried attention. No performance, just acknowledgement. I set my bag down and got to work. For an hour we existed in the same space, without directly occupying each other's attention, which had become its own kind of intimacy. The ability to be near someone without needing to perform the nearness. The kitchen thinned out earlier than usual because of the weather. Deliveries rescheduled, 2 staff members calling in late. By 5, it was quieter than I'd ever heard it on a Thursday. Just the rain and the low sounds of a kitchen winding toward evening. He came to my end of the kitchen with 2 bowls of whatever had been braising, set one in front of me without asking, same way he'd done with the espresso, and leaned against the counter across from me. "Eat," he said. "Is this a habit?" I asked. "Feeding people?" "Yes," he said. "Occupational reality." I tasted it. Lamb, something with preserved lemon. Herbs I identified automatically because that's just how my brain works now. It was extraordinary, and I told him so without dressing it up. Something in his expression shifted. Not pride exactly, more like relief. Like he'd needed the honest opinion more than the compliment. We talked while I ate. Real conversation, the kind that doesn't have an agenda. About Nashville, about what the city had been 5 years ago versus now, about a restaurant he'd eaten at in Charleston that had changed how he thought about simplicity in cooking. He talked with his hands when he was into something, which I hadn't noticed before, or maybe I had and hadn't let myself register it. The kitchen was almost fully empty when he moved from the counter to the stool beside me. Not across, beside, and the shift in proximity was quiet, but deliberate. Neither of us commented on it. The rain was heavier now against the windows. At some point, the conversation slowed into something more comfortable than silence usually is, with someone you're still figuring out. He was close enough that when he reached past me to set his bowl down, his arm grazed mine, and neither of us pulled back from it. We just stayed there, in the warm kitchen with the rain outside, closer than professional and not yet anything else. Then he turned his head and looked at me, really looked, and said low and even, "I haven't been able to stop thinking about Thursday." My pulse did something I chose not to examine. "Which part?" I said, though I already knew. He held my gaze. "All of it," he said. And the space between us, which had never been very large, suddenly felt like a question neither of us had answered yet. I didn't answer him right away. Not because I didn't know what to say, but because I knew exactly what to say, and I wasn't sure I was ready for what came after it. The rain was still going outside. The kitchen was warm and quiet and smelled like that lamb and preserved lemon and something underneath it all that I was choosing not to identify. He was still looking at me. Gideon had a way of waiting that didn't feel like pressure, It felt like patience, which was somehow harder to sit with. "This is a complicated situation," I said finally. "I know," he said. "I'm not pretending it isn't." "You have a history with Serena." "Had," he said. "It's been over for a long time. She doesn't factor into this." "She called you." "People call me," he said evenly. "That's not the same as them meaning something." I looked at him for a moment. He wasn't defensive, wasn't performing sincerity. He was just stating facts the way he always did, direct and without decoration. That was the thing about Gideon that made him difficult to dismiss. He didn't try to be charming when it mattered. He just told you the truth and let you decide what to do with it. "I'm not looking for something complicated," I said. "I know that too," he said. And then, quieter, "I'm not sure I'm looking for anything. But I know what I feel when you're in the room. And I know it's not nothing." The honesty of it landed somewhere in the middle of my chest and stayed there. I looked down at my hands for a second, then back at him. He hadn't moved, still beside me, still close, still patient in that way that made the whole room feel like it was holding its breath. I made a decision. Not a dramatic one, just the small, quiet kind that changes the direction of things without announcing itself. I leaned in and kissed him. Brief, soft, unhurried. Just enough to say yes to the question that had been sitting between us for weeks. He went still for exactly 1 second. Then his hand came up to my jaw, gentle and certain, and he kissed me back in a way that was nothing like brief. It was the kind of kiss that has a before and an after. When we pulled back, the rain was still going, and the kitchen was still warm, and everything looked exactly the same as it had 5 minutes ago, except that nothing was. He rested his forehead against mine for a moment, his thumb tracing a slow line along my jaw, and I let myself stay in it without cataloging what it meant or what came next. Just that, just him, just the rain. Then his phone buzzed on the counter behind him. He ignored it. It buzzed again. He exhaled slowly, pulled back just enough to look at me, and something in his expression made the warmth in my chest cool by a degree. "I have to get that," he said. "It's the other location." I nodded. He got up, and I heard him answer, professional, clipped, handling whatever it was. But when I glanced at the screen as he turned away, I caught one word at the top of the notification before it disappeared. Not a contact name, a text preview. 3 words that rearranged everything I'd just allowed myself to feel. I sat very still and waited for him to finish the call. He was on the phone for 4 minutes. I know because I watched the clock on the wall above the pass without meaning to, counting the seconds the way you do when you're trying to stay calm and running out of things to hold on to. The 3 words I'd seen on his screen were still sitting in my chest like something swallowed wrong. I hadn't seen enough to know what they meant, just enough to know they were from Serena, just enough to make the warmth of the last 10 minutes feel suddenly fragile. He came back to the counter, set the phone down face up this time, which felt deliberate, and looked at me with the kind of expression that's trying to read the room without giving itself away. "Everything okay?" he asked. "Fine," I said, which was not entirely true, but was also not entirely false, because I hadn't decided yet what I felt. That's the thing about catching a glimpse of something you weren't supposed to see. You spend more energy managing your reaction than actually processing the information. He sat back down. Not as close this time, which might have been coincidence, or might have been him reading the shift in my energy. With Gideon, it was hard to tell, because he paid attention to everything and rarely announced what he'd noticed. "That was the manager at the second location," he said. "Staffing issue." I nodded. He looked at me for a moment. "You saw the notification," he said, not a question. I met his eyes. I wasn't trying to. "I know," he said. He was quiet for a second, turning his phone over once in his hand. Then, "She's been texting for 2 weeks. I haven't responded to most of it." "You don't owe me an explanation," I said. "I know that too," he said. "I'm giving you one anyway." There was something in his voice that was different from his usual evenness. Not defensive, not rehearsed, just tired. Like a man who was used to keeping things uncomplicated and was finding that increasingly difficult. "Gideon," I said carefully, "what are we doing?" He looked at me for a long moment. "I don't know exactly," he said, "but I know I don't want to stop." It was honest. Frustratingly, specifically honest. Not a promise, not a performance, just a man telling me where he actually stood. Part of me wanted something cleaner. A clearer answer. A defined thing I could put in a category and know how to handle. But I'd spent enough time in clinical spaces to know that the most honest answers are rarely the tidiest ones. I reached over and picked up my jacket from the back of the stool. He watched me do it without moving. "I need a couple of days," I said. He nodded slowly. "Okay," he said. Just that. No argument, no negotiation. I appreciated it and resented it in equal measure, because it would have been easier if he'd pushed, easier to walk out, easier to build a case for distance. Instead, he just sat there, steady and patient, letting me have what I'd asked for. I left through the side door, the same one he always held open for me. This time, it was already propped. The rain had stopped while we were inside. The air smelled like wet pavement and something new, and I stood in it for a moment before walking to my car, turning over everything that had just happened, and trying very hard not to think about how much I already missed the warmth of that kitchen. I took my 2 days. I worked, I slept, I went to the farmer's market on Saturday morning the way I always did, and I did not check my phone more than was reasonable. That last part was not entirely true. He texted once. Saturday afternoon, no greeting, no context, just a name of a tea vendor at the market, with a note that said their chamomile was worth the line. Nothing else. I stood in front of that vendor's stall 20 minutes later, having found it without admitting to myself that I was looking, and bought 2 bags. That evening, I sat with a cup of it at my kitchen table and thought about what kind of man pays attention like that. The quiet, specific kind. The kind that notices what you drink and doesn't make a thing of it. The kind that is, I was beginning to understand, considerably more dangerous than any obvious charm ever could be. Tuesday, I went back. I'd made my decision somewhere between Saturday and Sunday, without formally announcing it to myself. The way you make the decisions that actually stick. I walked in and the kitchen was mid-prep and Gideon was at the pass. He looked up. I looked back. Neither of us said anything that the whole kitchen could hear, but something passed between us that didn't need words. I sat at my table and got to work. He came by 20 minutes later with coffee, real coffee this time, not espresso, and set it down and said quietly, close enough that it was just for me, "You came back." I said I needed a couple days, I said. Not forever. Something shifted in his expression. Not a smile exactly, but the thing that lives just underneath one. He pulled out the chair across from me and sat, unhurried, like a man who had decided to stop pretending he was only passing through. "I blocked her number," he said. I looked up. "Gideon, I'm not telling you because I want credit," he said. "I'm telling you because you deserve to know where I stand." I held his gaze for a moment. He was steady, the way he always was, but underneath it, if you knew how to look, there was something that cost him something to say. I reached across the table and covered his hand with mine. Just for a second. Just enough. He turned his hand over, and his fingers closed around mine briefly before I pulled back, and the kitchen moved around us like nothing had happened at all. But everything had, and we both knew it. What I didn't know, what I couldn't have known sitting there in that warm kitchen with bad coffee and something new blooming quietly between us, was that the hardest part wasn't behind us yet. It was already on its way. The next 3 weeks were the best kind of complicated. Nothing had been formally named between us. No conversation with labels, no definitions negotiated over a table. But something had settled into place that felt more real than most named things I'd known. He texted in the mornings, small things. A supplier who'd come through with early season persimmons. A question about a menu note I'd left. Once, on a Wednesday with no professional justification whatsoever, just a photo of the Nashville skyline from the restaurant roof at 6 a.m. with no caption. I saved it without analyzing why. At Embers, we moved around each other differently now. Closer, easier, with the particular comfort of two people who have stopped pretending they don't notice each other. He'd find reasons to be near my end of the kitchen. I'd stopped pretending I didn't track where he was in the room. Alex had stopped commenting, which meant he'd moved from amused observer to quietly rooting for us, which I found oddly touching. One evening after service, Gideon walked me to my car, not the side door this time, all the way to the parking lot, and we stood in the cooling air talking about nothing important for 20 minutes. Neither of us had a reason to spend that way. Before I got in, he tucked a strand of hair behind my ear, slow and deliberate, his fingers grazing my jaw, and looked at me like he was figuring something out. Then he kissed me, unhurried, warm, certain, and pulled back with that almost smile and said, "Drive safe." I drove home feeling like someone had turned a light on in a room I'd forgotten existed. That was Thursday. On Friday, he didn't come in. The kitchen ran fine. His sous chef handled service without issue. But his absence had a shape I felt all day without wanting to. He didn't text. By Saturday morning, the silence had a different quality than the comfortable kind. And I sat with my chamomile and told myself I was being unreasonable. Sunday, I got a call from Dana, the woman from the wedding who'd hugged him like family. I didn't know she had my number. She said she was sorry to call out of nowhere. She said there'd been an incident at the second location. A kitchen accident. Nothing life-threatening, but serious enough. She said Gideon had been there since Friday morning, managing the fallout, and that he'd asked her to call me, which meant he was in a situation bad enough that he couldn't do it himself, but present enough to think of me. Which told me everything about where I stood, and nothing about whether I was ready for what standing there actually meant. And that's where we leave Freya and Gideon for now. If this story has been living in your head the way it's been living in ours, drop a number from 1 to 10 in the comments and tell us exactly how you're feeling. Part 3 is coming, and trust us, you don't want to miss what happens next. Thank you for being here, for listening, and for making stories like this worth telling. We'll see you in the next one.